Hi, I'm Tom Landry. I'm here to interview Mr. Brian Brumbaugh for the Northwest Diving History Association. Brian has been a key player in the diving history of the Pacific Northwest ever since the 50s. And so we're going to have a little interview with him and let him tell us his story. Brian, what inspired you to get involved with diving?
Well, I had the unique opportunity of being born into a family that was already diving when I was born. And so I actually grew up in it. My brother-in-law, who was dating my sister, which is 15 years older than me when I was born, had already started freediving and had gone to work for one of the two first dive stores in the Pacific Northwest called Puget Sound Divers on Westlake in Seattle.
When was that?
That was 1951, I believe, 50 or 51. It was owned by a man by the name of Dave LeClaire, who owned a commercial fishing boat manufacturing company, and they took the front part of that facility and made a dive store out of it. And it was made initially to supply diving equipment for his wife who wanted to dive. And there was no equipment available, and so they opened the store and started a club called Puget Sound Mud Sharks, which was a competitive spearfishing club. At the same time in Seattle, there was a dive store that opened up in West Seattle called Seattle Skid Divers, and that was owned by Frank Wolf, and he and Puget Sound Divers were the first stores in the early 50s.
Now, you probably should mention in this interview that your brother-in-law is Gary Keffler, owner of Underwater Sports.
He was the manager of Puget Sound Divers from 1954 to 1959, and left in '59 and opened Underwater Sports on Roosevelt Way in 1960. Stayed there until 1965, and then moved to Boat Street on Lake Union, and stayed there until 1972, and purchased the third oldest diving business, which was marker buoys on Aurora. They originally were started in the mid-50s in Ballard. Yeah, Frank and Elma Miller were the owners of that particular store.
Now, you mentioned the Mud Sharks. Tell us a little bit about the Mud Sharks.
Mud Sharks were a competitive spearfishing club. They were one of the rivals in the country on the amount of trophies that they won. This was three-person competitive spearfishing meets that we had many of in the 50s and 60s.
Who were the members of the Mud Sharks?
Well, there were lots of different members. You usually ran a membership of about 40 people at all times, but it was really founded by the very first divers in the Pacific Northwest. One was a Jim Blanchard, who came from Everett. Bill Mertz. Gary Keffler was certainly part of it, but he wasn't one of the founding members of it. Through the middle of the 50s, there was an offshoot. A number of people left the Mud Sharks and started a different company called dive club called the Blackfish. And there was a real rivalry between the Blackfish and Mud Sharks.
And which group are you involved with?
The Mud Sharks.
And obviously the Mud Sharks and the Blackfish were competitive spearfishing clubs.
Predominantly.
And you would go out and compete in competitions, and
they were breath holding competitions. It was the meets were anywhere from 4 to 5 hours. It was the weight of the accumulation of fish that you spearfished during that period of time. You had 3-man teams, and you weighed up the weight from all 3 members, and whoever had the most won the meet.
And this went on year-round?
It did go on year-round. There was set meets that were at the same time each year. In the middle of January, there was one that was in Deception Pass, for example, called the Winter Meet. And then you also had elimination meets to be able to compete in national tournaments. national spearfishing tournaments, and they consisted of 4 to 6 meets, and the top 3 people, and this was all of the clubs that competed against each other. It was individual competition, and the top 3 would then represent the state of Washington in the National Spearfishing Championships.
Okay, so that brings us up to where are we at?
We're probably, I mean, there's a lot of stuff that went on in the 60s, but, you know, it was just the evolution of diving.
Let's talk a little bit about your days with Ted Griffin.
Well, we had an active involvement in the catching of all of the killer whales in captivity except 6. There were 2 in Vancouver that were caught by the Vancouver Aquarium.
Let me stop you. Why don't you tell us who Ted Griffin was first?
Ted Griffin was an entrepreneur who purchased an aquarium from Ivor Haglund on Pier 56 in about 1960. And it was a public aquarium at the end of the dock. And if anybody doesn't know who Ivor Haglund was, it's Ivor's Seafood Restaurants. He was quite a character in Seattle marine history. Ted, starting about 1962, had a desire of catching killer whales. Now, what kind of got him into it is he was the first person to catch a 6-gilled shark in Puget Sound. And the first one he caught was 17 feet long, caught in about 250 feet of water, straight out in front of the aquarium at Pier 56. He caught, through a summer, 4 or 5 of them that would live for not a very long period of time in the aquarium because they were deep water fish. But I think the largest one was 23 feet. This brought a tremendous amount of people to the aquarium. And so he came up with the idea of wanting to catch a killer whale. And he tried multiple ways of doing it. He tried tranquilizing them from helicopters, catching them from helicopters. He failed reasonably miserably for several years. In 1966, I think it was 65 or 66, Namu was caught by some fishermen just outside of Namu, British Columbia. And Namu was a female with a calf, and these fishermen had put out their net, and the net collapsed against a rock, and the killer whales were on the inside of it. And it was well known that Ted was looking to buy a killer whale, and these fishermen got a hold of him. He flew up to Namu and purchased the whales without having any ability to get them back, which was kind of a unique problem. A local radio personality by the name of Bob Hardwick owned a small tugboat and volunteered to pull them back, and so they went up and made a giant cage out of netting and 50-gallon barrels, stuck the whales in it, hooked up the tugboat, and made about 1.5 knots an hour. And they figured that the animals would probably die of starvation before they could get them back. So Foss Tug and Barge came up and started the haul. Gary Keffler was flown up to do diving on the pen on the way back, and stayed for 3 weeks on the boat, bringing it back to Seattle.
Did he dive in the cage with the whales?
He did dive. Well, I don't know that he was in the inside. He was on the outside a lot because it was picking up kelp and on driftwood and stuff like that had to be cleared away so that they could keep going without pushing the stuff through the water. I'm not sure that he actually was in the inside of that one. The male bull followed the 2 down as far as Deception Pass. And finally at Deception Pass turned around and left and never came back. The female was let loose, and the adolescent, you might say, which was 19 feet long, wasn't really an adolescent, was housed in the Seattle Marine Aquarium for a year in the summertime, and then went to Rich Passage by Port Orchard and was housed in a little cove there. It was also used in the movie Namu the Killer Whale that Ivan Torres filmed in San Juan Island at Roach Harbor. that was a major motion picture.
So what was your involvement then with Ted in the catching of killer whales?
Well, after we had the first one, there was a tremendous desire by aquariums to have killer whales, and so Ted took on a partner by the name of Don Goldsberry, who was the curator of the Point Defiance aquarium. He had been an active fisherman also, and knew the fishing people of Gig Harbor, and they hired two different companies that were purse seiners to go out and attempt to purse seine killer whales that came into Puget Sound, and of which they would have to drive them, not unlike you drive cattle, into shallow bays where the net could go to the bottom and wouldn't have too much current. Divers were then used to secure the nets, put anchors out. We'd be in the inside of the nets also, and then they had a procedure of lassoing the killer whales, at which time divers would get in the water and put ropes around the tails. You'd have a rope around the front of the whale, and then it would be tied off and picked up and put onto a fishing boat and either taken directly to the aquarium or taken to a boat launching ramp where a truck would come and pick it up and drive it to the boat launching ramp. We caught approximately 38 that way.
And your job was what?
One of the divers.
And did you get into the tank with the whales?
Absolutely.
And helping the whales in distress? And
we our procedure for whales that got caught in the net was just to cut them loose and turn them loose. And so yeah, we did that. It was all of the a major portion of the catch was the diver being in the water and putting a rope around the tail. So.
And how long did you do this for?
We did it until 1975.
And where was this at?
This was all in Puget Sound.
All over Puget Sound?
Yep.
South Sound all the way up through?
Well, South Sound, the furthest we ever went was the bay just before Deception Pass, Penn Cove. Yeah, Penn Cove is the furthest we went. There were a number of times in Yukon Harbor, just by Manchester. Henderson Bay in Gig Harbor was 3 or 4 times. Killer whales were very predictable. They would be in the same place at the same time each year. So they would come back, for example, and be in Henderson Bay the 3rd week of January. So we'd be ready to fish the 3rd week of January. They'd also come back in August. And so after we realized that, we would be in these places when they came.
And who did you work with in those days when you're catching killer whales?
Well,
some of the names.
Well, Don Goldsberry and Ted Griffin, of course, were the owners of the company. The owners of the boat were Pete Babbage, had one of them, and Adam Ross had the Chinook, and later the Dana R. There was Jerry Brown that took part in it, Bill High, who's affiliated with NWDHA, Gary Keffler, of course, Dale Dean, Ted Roethlisberger, Jim McMahon, Peter Ward.
A lot of old-time guys.
A lot of old-time guys, yeah. That was a long time ago.
So then what? After the killer whales was over?
Well, I had worked in my brother-in-law's store from 1960 when he first opened up Underwater Sports. It was a unique time, even going back into the 50s. We had, at Puget Sound Divers, we had a large 12-foot tank that we had 2 attempts to break the record of staying underwater the longest. The first one was done by Mac Thompson, who later invented the Pisces submarine, and he stayed underwater for 3 days, and you'd have to eat, sleep, drink, and we did have communications in those days. We put TVs outside the window so they had something to do, but he woke up and didn't realize where he was, and he was about 4 hours short of breaking the record and broke the surface. And once you break the surface, it's the end of the program. The other one was in I think 1961. It was Dale Rosberg, and he did break the record, and that was at a grocery store. They put the tank up in a grocery store. So there was a lot of fun things that happened in those early years.
Now you're also a NWDHA instructor.
Worked in the family business till 1972. I became an instructor in 1971 with NWDHA, and was an active instructor throughout the entire 70s. I had my own store in Everett and in Port Angeles. Sold those and went back and worked in the family business in underwater sports in Tacoma. In 1980, I went into the repping business and was a rep in the sporting goods and diving business for a number of companies, including U.S. Divers.
And now what?
Well, now I'm not into diving anymore. I do diving as a sport, but I'm not in the business any longer. I think we're done.
Okay.